Hello, everyone. Right, happy to see you again. See, still the same, or imagine you're behind your screen, which is good enough so far. So I hope everybody's doing well, and I hope that this week has been good to you. Um, so I'm sorry I warned you late about this morning because in my mind it was clear that there would be a lesson this morning, but I totally forgot to tell you more precisely about this. So I'm really sorry for this. Right, for those who would wake up later, right, this video is going to stay for some moment. The traditional news from our virtual meeting, which is no news from Cambridge. Absolutely no news from Cambridge, which starts becoming not a problem but a concern because next week we have to fill in the livret scolaire and we have to fill in the school reports and we have to fill in all the elements that will enable you to get your baccalaureate and so on. So we still have no news about this. So as usual, I will let you know as soon as I know. Okay. Right. Today, hello to people. It's a pleasure having you in this early morning sunny day. What a pleasure to wake up and meet Margaret Thatcher again. I'm sure that's the reason why you're waking up early, because you want some news about Margaret Thatcher. So just a short reminder of what we've done so far, and that will leave time maybe to some people to come and join us. So on the previous episode, we have explained that Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1979 as the head of the Conservative Party, and that she had a plan for reforming the United Kingdom. She had a plan for totally transforming how economic policy was made in the UK, and that she was determined to change this. She was inspired by the neoliberal movement, monetarianism. She wanted to encourage business and private initiative and entrepreneurship instead of maybe a nanny state, not maybe, instead of the nanny state and the welfare state and what she would call a socialist economy. To do this, she started reducing government spendings as early as 1980 and 1981, if you remember. These were austerity budgets, right? And the short-term consequences that you can see on the chart is that unemployment doubled in the UK. In 1983, more than 10% of the British population was undergoing unemployment, and that started increasing the economic and social difficulties in the United Kingdom. Okay, she became very unpopular. The surveys showed that she had one quarter of the population of the electorate as a support. Hello to newcomers. Hello all of you, and that she had fewer and fewer supporters in the UK. And then the game changer being the Falkland War. And if you remember what I've told you, she got the support of some of the press, especially the conservative tabloids, which supported her all through the crisis, enabled her to play on a kind of Churchillian like mythology maybe, or Churchillian leadership. And at the end of the Falkland crisis, at the end of the Falkland War, once the UK had won the war, which was not which was not the hardest war for the UK to win, clearly, she appeared as a nation leader. She appeared as a real iron lady determined to go through all the obstacles. Okay? And this is how Margaret Thatcher became the Margaret Thatcher which is remembered today, because she accelerated her reforms toward a more liberal, a more conservative, a more anti-Keynesian, anti-socialist Britain. And today we are going to analyze what we call Thatcher second stage. So some said it started in 83 after the Falkland War. Some said, hello newcomers, happy to see you here. Some say that her second stage of politics started in 1983. Some say that the second game changer was the miners' strike in the United Kingdom that took place in 1984-85. And so between today and next Monday, I will try to tell you how the miners' strikes changed the United Kingdom and why Margaret Thatcher was able to implement all her reforms, all her liberal policies in the second half of the 1980s. Okay? So normally I need something like 1 hour and a half, so I hope that Monday it's going to be fully over. We'll also study the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, because she's left a very long-term legacy, right? Good. Now, a major element to understand the second part of her mandate is the miners' strikes that happened in the United Kingdom in 1984, started in 1984 and eventually ended by Margaret Thatcher victory. There's no other word for this, in 1985. Let me explain you with the context. In case you want to follow all this, it's in the lesson, right? On Moodle, there is a summary or a presentation of I can't remember what it's called. It must be called Thatcher 83 1990. Actually, that's the name of the fiche. Let me just check, because I had it like a few minutes ago in front of me, but can't find it anymore. It was on my other computer. Absolutely, it's called Thatcher. Sorry, it's called Thatcher Main Facts. Thatcher Main Facts 8390. So in case you have this is what we're going to use today. So, right. Let me explain you the basics of these miners' strikes and why it was a major challenge for Margaret Thatcher. If you remember, in the first Labour government led by Clement Attlee, coal was at the center of the Labour policies, and there were several reasons for this. Firstly, sorry, I'm going to shut the window for better. Yeah, that's much better. Yes, the mining activity in the UK was really symbolic for the Labour Party in 1945. And if you remember, they decided to nationalize the mining activity. They created an institution called the NCB, the National Coal Board. The National Coal Board. Why was it so important for the Labour to nationalize the coal activity in 1945? Firstly, because miners had been a key group of workers supporting the Labour Party. In the places where the mining activity was the core of the activity, Labour representatives, Labour delegates, Labour members of parliament would win elections by like 80 or 90%, right? If you think of Scotland, I remember someone asking me, why did Scotland Why did the Scots hate or rejected Margaret Thatcher so much? Because in Scotland, you had this mining activity. In southern Wales, if you remember, for some of you, we made a trip last year and we went to Blenhaven, right? And that's with a big pit mining center. And all these places were key labor electorates, okay? So the miner was a kind of symbol of what a worker was. Someone doing a very physical job, someone generally dying much younger than the rest of the population due to, lung and respiratory problems. People who lived as a community, because when you were living as a miner, you were living in the whole community, right? All the families were generally working in the mining activity. Men and young boys would go down to the pit very early, very young. Women would generally work in jobs associated to the mines. So to say it differently, for the Labour Party after World War II, it was a matter of social justice to improve the conditions of the miners. Also, if you remember, the UK could then be autonomous. Could be autonomous on self-sufficient. That's the word I was looking for. Self-sufficient in energy. So it was decided in 1945 to nationalize the coal industry, which means that for the next decades, the miners' unions, and especially the NUM, the National Union of Miners, would be one of the strongest trade unions in the UK. What does that mean? It means that they were able to organize very quickly, and they were able to stop. That's very important for the what would come next. So make sure you've understood this. They could organize very fast to stop the production, to go on strike and stop the production. They did this in the 1970s, if you remember, and they obtained the 3-day working week. Okay, in the 1970s, they decided to block the pits, to block the mines, which means that there was no production of coal, and that on the short term, that was threatening the British economy. So they obtained a 3-day week. And Margaret Thatcher, who was a member of parliament at that time as a conservative, she was what you call a backbencher. When you're a backbencher, you're not one of the most important figures of your party. You sit in the back of the benches in the parliament. So you're a backbencher. But she remembered how difficult it was to handle the miners when they went on strike. And from then, she was personally convinced that without breaking the resistance of the miners and breaking the resistance of the miners' union, she wouldn't be able to go as far as she had wanted into reforming the UK. If you want to be a bit more caricatural, you could say after defeating the RGs, the Argentinians, right, she would defeat the miners. And one reason, she didn't want to defeat them just for pleasure. If you look at the chart you've got in front of you on the screen, there was a real economic problem with coal. In the 1970s and 1980s, the British coal was less and less profitable. There were many reasons for this. Firstly, cheaper coal could be imported from other countries. Eastern European countries, I'm thinking of Poland or Ukraine. Ukraine was not independent at that time, it was part of the USSR, but some still communist countries at that time exported coal. and this coal was bought by the Western countries. So you could find cheaper coal. You could also find cheaper coal in developing countries. Secondly, new energies could now compete with coal in terms of efficiency, oil, and if you know this, in the 1980s, oil was being exploited in the North Sea, offshore in Scotland, or for example. And the nuclear energy in the 1970s and 80s was also becoming more profitable, especially when it came to producing electricity. So clearly, the coal mines were less and less profitable, and it was more expensive to use British coal. Okay? So there was a real economic concern, and that's the second box in your chart. Did the British mines, did they have a future? Was it reasonable? Was it wise to maintain the mining activity? So there was a real economic problem. But it was not an easy one to solve, because by closing the British mines, there was no doubt that unemployment and misery would spread immediately in many, many areas in the UK, in Scotland, in Wales, in the regions of Liverpool, Manchester, what you call the Lancashire, around Birmingham, everything which was known as the Black Countries in the 19th centuries, all these regions which had developed on this coal and metal activity. So what was at stake? I don't know if you see this. I'm not talking about Thatcher, and I'm not talking about the miners. I'm talking about them, but it was a general problem. Margaret Thatcher was not responsible for the coal problem. So to put it in a nutshell, coal had been the basis of 1.5 centuries of industrial activity in the UK. Since the first industrial revolution, I said 1.5 centuries, we could say almost 2 centuries since James Watt. So coal was at the heart of the British identity as an industrial nation. Millions of people in the country were depending on the coal activity, either directly, being miners working for the National Coal Board, or living in a family where mining was important. And you had entire regions of the UK that lived on coal. And the survival of this community was at the heart of the question. Okay? Now, once you know this, there were 3 solutions. First solution, preparing a long-term way out of the mining activity. Like, for example, waiting for some time, decades maybe, and every time miners, would go to a retirement, close the mines slightly, like accepting that the mining activity was declining, but do that on a long term. That was a plan that the Labour Party had considered. Secondly, for social reasons, to avoid destroying communities, maintain the mining activity, even as a deficitary activity, even as a declining activity, just to protect the people who lived from this activity. That would be what the NUM, the National Union of Miners, would defend all through the strike. Maintain the mining activity, because this is what makes communities in many places in England and Wales and Scotland live. Thirdly, cut the dead branch. Consider that the coal activity is dead, and so mines should close, whatever the social consequences would be, because it would be an economic approach first. I'm sure you've already guessed that this was the solution decided by Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher went into the full Monty decision. All mines, all pits should close. And it should be done because when an economic activity is not profitable anymore, there's no reason for you to maintain it. Okay? An economic approach first. That's what economic liberalism is about. And she would kill two birds with one stone, because by closing the mines, she would also totally destroy the power of the trade unions of miners. And once the miners would be deprived of their capacity to block the country, then she could reform the other sectors. You see it? It's a double track strategy. Like, firstly, we close the mines for economic reasons. And by closing the mines, we take the power from the unions of miners to block the country. If you want a comparison, and it's for what it's worth, right? But if you want a comparison, it's exactly the same type of power the miners had in social relations as the les cheminots in France. Globally, I think it's less true today. But 20 years ago, actually it was the case 25 years ago during the great 1995 strikes in France. I was there as a young man, and that prevented me from completing my master's degree. But it's fine. It was a fun moment. Anyway, no regret. The railway men in France, les cheminots, they totally paralyzed the country in 1995. Like, there was not a single train circulating. So if you manage to destroy the power of the railway men unions in France, you will mostly get rid of all the unions' capacity to block the country. You see what I mean? You won't block the country with a teachers' union or nurses' union. Nurses' union, you could do that, but they're not as powerful as the railwaymen union. In the UK, it was the miners' unions who played that role of being able to mobilize a full country and block the economy so as to obtain what they wanted. They had the power of negotiation stronger than any other union. I hope that's clear. Just let me know if you think something is not clear, okay? Don't hesitate and leave some questions or message in the chat, okay? In the chat, sorry. It's clear? Brilliant. If you remember what I've told you, in the 1970s, the miners had obtained some rights, new rights, like fewer working days in a week, by going on strike. Because in a few weeks, they could paralyze the British economy because no more coal was being delivered. Margaret Thatcher remembered this, and immediately after the Falkland War, she took a secret. She took a strategic decision, which remains secret. She decided to start storaging coal. A share of the coal produced in the UK each month started to be accumulated as a strategic stock. Because Margaret Thatcher knew that she had to prepare for a long social confrontation. And so she decided to accumulate or storage some coal which would remain available even during the strike with the miners, because she knew there would be strikes in the mining activity. So she got prepared for this. So as early, actually it started before the Falkland War, right? But the UK accumulated some reserve coal for harder times, which is something that the miners' unions did not really see. They were not aware of this. And that's important because when they started their strike, they thought they could block the British economy, and suddenly they discovered that, wow, it was not as efficient as usually because the government had some coal in reserve. And so, who were the different actors in this crisis? I'm spending a lot of time on this, not because I believe you love histories about coal. I'm sure you don't specifically, but let me explain you. Let me give you my historical motivations for doing this. I'm not doing this just to gain some time or get you bored. Firstly, because it definitely was the moment, as I've told you, when Margaret Thatcher won in the UK. She got rid of the last obstacle between her and the reforms she wanted to do. Secondly, because as you know, I'm sure you've guessed this for the last 3 years, and I share this with my colleague, Mr. Eropoulos, social history and the history of how communities really live is as important as a history of the great characters and so on. But most of the time, what is important in history is not just studying the people of power, Margaret Thatcher, Clement Attlee, Ronald Reagan, or just getting into just the people down under, the people of the bottom, like the miners and so on. What is interesting in history is to see how they interact. And here you've got a perfect illustration of this. Who were the protagonists? So if you look at the charts, what was proposed by the various agents in this crisis? So the National Union of Miners said, yes, we can maintain the mining activity if the government invests. The National Coal Board, which was the corporation created in 1947 when coal was nationalized, say, yes, we can maintain some mining activity. Not all mines are unprofitable, but there are places where we should close. There are places where we should close the mines. So we need to start a negotiation. Where should it be closed? Okay, and where should they be maintained? And then you had Margaret Thatcher, and Margaret Thatcher supported the most intransigent, the most radical economic reform. Let's close as many mines as possible. And what happened is that in front of her, so the man who was in charge of negotiating this was called MacGregor. He was the leader of, he was the head of the NCB, of the National Coal Board. And in front of him, you had the leader of the National Union of Miners. And the National Union of Miners decided to go on as tough, as radical, as intransigent position as Thatcher. The man who was at the head of all this was this man. Sorry, I'm just looking for his photo, but I forgot to record it, save it. The name who was at the leader of the NUM was called Arthur Scargill. And Scargill was actually he was a Marxist, right? He promoted oh yes, I've been replaced by Arthur Scargill, which is fine. That's this man, and he decided to act how can I say this? Uncompromisingly. Because he thought that the miners would be able to win this. Problem. In the very beginning of the crisis, oh sorry, I should have told you. So in 1984, which is a wonderful date as you know, in 1984, the miners went on strike. And Arthur Scargill said, we're going to be on strike until all the mining activity is officially preserved. It's an all or nothing strategy. In front of him, Margaret Thatcher, which is absolutely all or nothing, will close all the mines, period. Eventually, the strike lasted for 13 months. The miners went on strike for 13 months. But as you know, as Margaret Thatcher had planned this, had foreseen this before, she was able, and the Ministry of Economy and the National Coal Board was able to deliver coal for 13 months to the United Kingdom thanks to the strategic stocks that had been made. And so, little by little, the miners' communities started to, get exhausted because they had no revenue. In the beginning, the National Union of Miners was able to organize solidarity revenues, like, collecting money from all the other trade unions and so on. But after 13 months, this strategy reached a dead end, and the miners were like totally exhausted. There were many moments, so I'm going to try something, so if it doesn't work, please apologize. I'm going to start a new strategy. I want to show you a video, but I'm not sure it's going to work well. So if it doesn't work well, please apologize. I'd like to show you one moment in which has crystallized, which has embodied this confrontation, because little by little, the miners got more frustrated, and they started to organize more radical and more massive demonstrations. And there is a very famous moment called the Battle of Orgrave, which is a massive confrontation between thousands of miners and thousands of policemen in the UK, right? And that has remained very famous for the violence with which the police would break the strike. In Orgrave, actually, the miners had decided not only to go on strike, but to organize a blockade of the mine, which means that even the miners who wanted to work, they couldn't get into the mines. And so in the UK, you can go on strike, but you can't prevent the people who want to work anyway, in spite of the strike, to go to work. And this is what the miners in Orgrave did. They decided to say, no, not a single miner is going to enter this pit. And that ended in a confrontation. That ended in a confrontation with the police. So I'm trying something. If it doesn't work, please apologize. It worked when I tried alone, but maybe it won't work this time. I'm going to show you a video, so hopefully it will work. Right, that's it. And right, that's it. So I don't know if it's working or not. If it's not, I will end, so please apologize.
By 7 a.m., 4,000 miners were at Orgrave waiting for the coke lorries to arrive. Police had been expecting them. They equaled the number of pickets. When the lorries came an hour later, the miners' ranks had swelled to more than 5,000. As the last lorry went in, the trouble started. Pickets charged straight into the police riot shields. In In seconds, a pack of police 20 deep was fighting a shower of stones to hold the pickets back. The first cavalry charge came a few minutes later, and it clearly worried the pickets. More police reinforcements, this time taking advantage of the confusion caused by the horses. As the horses came back, pickets threw half bricks at them. Then they started on the front line of police.
So as you can see, that was a moment when definitely it was decided that miners would have to be miners' resistance had to be broken. When I say resistance, I mean I use it in the common sense, right? I'm not saying that they were the Jean Moulin of anything, but just that, as you can see, Margaret Thatcher was clearly determined to. I'm back to my. Original thing. Sorry, I'm just I'm just learning on all this. So I have to go back there. Right, that's fine. That the police and Margaret Thatcher decided to go, into a full confrontation with the miners, and so that participated to the miners' popularity declining in the opinion, because now the miners were seen as people who were violent and who were too radical. Okay, so just to summarize all this, and I'm about to conclude on this minor strike. Sorry for spending so much time on it, but that will totally clear why Margaret Thatcher had a full free way, okay, after this. So, clearly, after the Battle of Orgreave and after such events, the miners' union lost the support of the other trade unions. The transport unions, the public servants union thought the miners had been too radical and too violent. After 13 months, the miners stopped the strike, and 90% of the British mines had to close. So Margaret Thatcher had won this battle by systematically supporting the National Coal Board for closing the mines. So now, if you want the answer to your question, why was Margaret Thatcher so hated and in Scotland? Why was Glasgow, for example, why was Glasgow one of the cities where you had all these people dancing, on the song, hey, hey, ding dong, the witch is dead, and celebrating Margaret Thatcher's death? Why did that happen in Glasgow, for example? Because in Glasgow and in the Scottish community, some cities had a 40% unemployment rate after Margaret Thatcher and the governments and the SCB decision to close the mines. Okay? Right. So, remember, the lady is not for turning. The lady is determined to go through her own policies. After this, nothing would ever be the same in the UK under Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher was ready for a next stage of reform. What you can call, sorry, I will need this. I'm getting back to my original place. It was a time for Thatcher's second stage of reforms. And now that would be what you call a supply side policy. As you know, in the economy, you have two conceptions based on supply and demand. L'offre et la demande. Supply policies mean supply side policies mean supporting business. What is at the heart of economic prosperity is when business is able to work freely, to work as freely as possible, not to be entangled by regulation, taxation, so as to encourage investments, so as to encourage innovation, so as to encourage large production, which, if you remember, is the opposite to the Keynesian policies who support demand, the consumers. How do you encourage the supply side of the economy? First box, to create economic growth, you have to reduce the taxes. That's very liberal, right? Reduce taxation. And especially reduce taxation on two categories. Reduce taxation on the business, reduce taxation on the companies, and reduce taxation on the wealthiest people. Why should you reduce taxation on the wealthiest people? Because by reducing taxation on the wealthiest people, you will encourage people into becoming wealthy. That's it. The wealthier you can be, that's a liberal conception right now. I mean, you can share it or not, but the wealthier people can become, the more innovative and the more initiative they will take. So you have to encourage competition. If you want people to be innovative, you have to have a full competition. And there is no competition when the state controls some economic sectors. So you have to privatize activities, clearly. To make sure companies won't meet too many obstacles, you have to reduce the power of negotiations of the workers. Give more rights to companies, fewer rights to workers. So the best way is to limit the power of the trade union. So you have to break the National Union of Miners, for example. And if you want people to work, and if you want people to create wealth, and if you want people to develop individual initiative, don't support them too much. So reduce welfare. Okay? It's quite easy. People, it's the very famous prejudice that people who are getting unemployment benefit don't search for jobs because the state pays for their unemployed moment. So let's reduce this and people will have to look for jobs and work. Okay? How did she act? She chose 3 methods, which are in the second box, the one called methods. Okay. Deregulation. Maybe that's something you've studied with my colleague, actually. Deregulation means there are too many laws, there are too many rules, there are too many instructions, legal instruction that prevent people from developing business. Example, there are sectors in which limiting the working time is a mistake. There are sectors in which limiting investments for financial safety is a mistake. The banking system, for example. So rules are here to protect. But sometimes, Margaret Thatcher said, most of the time, rules prevent people from taking initiatives and developing the economy. I give you the best example for rules. If you have to hire a new worker and you know that you won't be able to lay this worker off easily, people won't hire new workers. So it's good if companies can fire workers more easily. That's exactly what deregulation is about. Also, privatization. Margaret Thatcher would start a large set of privatization, including many sectors. I don't know if you've got the lesson in front of your eyes or not, but you will find it in the lesson. Sorry, I should have told you when I talked about deregulation. For example, one thing she did was that she encouraged the creation of private transport companies. Okay, and before, when you wanted to open a new transport network, you would have to go through in the UK a whole set of administrative process and filling in many papers and going through many security checks and so on. Now, if you wanted to open a local transport network, the state could not oppose it, which was not the case before. In education, which was a public education, if you remember, a state education, she encouraged the creation of private schools. School that would get private financement. And more than this, she encouraged the state schools, so schools provided financed by the state, to find private money to add some financial resources to the school. Let me tell you a story. A personal anecdote on this. It happened the same thing was done in Ireland at the same time. And I was lucky enough to spend some months in Ireland at the end of the 1990s. I was observing classes in Ireland. And I perfectly remember it was a history class I was attending. It was, I think there were kids like were 12 or 13. It was a lesson about the plantation in Ireland. I perfectly remember. And there was a loudspeaker in the class. There was a loudspeaker in the wall, in the wall just behind the teacher. And suddenly I heard a kind of signal, right? Some alarm or something, like a bell ringing. And it was the head of school. Saying that he had an important message to deliver to the class. So firstly, I discovered that in each class in Ireland, but that was very common in England too, the head could speak directly to the classes through a system of loudspeakers and see. So he said, which means that he could also listen to what was happening in the class, right? It was a way also to see what was happening in the class. And the announcement was, dear pupils, dear teachers, if you go to Tesco, Tesco is a retail store, like the British Carrefour, if you want. If you go to the local Tesco this week, and you buy for more than £100 of a supply, the school will get vouchers to buy computers. So imagine you're like in the middle of your class. Then can you imagine this in Jean-Zé? You're like in the middle of an OIB, an exciting OIB class about the miners' strike, and suddenly it's bonjour, cher terminal. Aujourd'hui, Carrefour Place d'Arc, pour 50 € acheté, une tablette offerte au lycée Jean-Zé. And then you would go back to your normal activity. I don't know how you would react, actually. Maybe some of you would support this. As if, your class would be like sponsored or anything. That's something that Margaret Thatcher totally encouraged, because she said that's a way to bring more money into the education system by encouraging private financement of the system, and so in the meantime reducing the state expenses. Okay, that's an example of what you call deregulation. Also, many companies were privatized. Okay, you see in the lesson, She privatized, I can't remember precisely how many, between 50 and 60 different companies that used to belong to the state and now were sold fully or partly. The most important ones, British Airways, the national air company, British Steel and British Coal. So there was very little coal left, but it was privatized. British Telecom, the railways, and so on. Right? She finally made a major reform, and that's going to be my conclusion for today, which is known as the Big Bang. And the Big Bang is Margaret Thatcher decided that the stock exchange activities in the city, the city is the financial district in London, that the activities in this sector would now be much freer. For example, before you had banks who specialized in having only private consumers, private customers, like your family savings or credit for the households to buy a new car or a new home. And this is customer banks. And you had banks which were into business banks, like lending money to companies, investing in the stock exchange, and so on. Suddenly, the difference between these two sectors vanished. Now, any bank that was serving local customers could also invest in the stock exchange, could also invest in major financial markets. And so it means that the limits, the boundary between small banks or local banks and major international business banks would disappear. So it was a complete, and so everybody could invest much more easily. Everybody could invest much more easily in the stock exchange. And that was called the Big Bang. That's also the moment when the stock exchange went on computers, which means that little by little, instead of having people selling and buying in the stock exchange, you would have computer operations. Okay, what was the consequence of all this? Of all these policies? Unemployment kept on increasing for 2 years because many sectors were badly hurt by these policies. The transport sectors, the mining sectors, the industrial sector suffered massive losses in employment. In 1985, okay, you had almost 3.5 million jobless people. And from there, unemployment massively declined. Why? Because all the industrial activities that were declining were sold to private companies, and these companies fired many workers. But after a few years, these companies started being profitable again, and a tertiary sector developed in the UK, leading to a massive decrease in unemployment. Between 1985 and 1990, unemployment in the UK was divided by 2. So it dropped from 3.5 to 1.8 million. So it still was a lot. 1.8 million is still a lot. But that means that if you want to evaluate Thatcher's achievements honestly, on a longer term, economically speaking, her policies worked. And it mostly worked for the upper class and for the middle class. And clearly the middle class benefited, economically speaking, from Margaret Thatcher's reform. Problem, the people who remained unemployed, especially in the working class, the former miners, the former steel workers, the former car manufacturing workers, they received much less money from the state because the consequence of Thatcher's policies was that the state reduced its spendings in the welfare system. Okay. So to conclude for today, I'm going to conclude on Margaret Thatcher's re-election. In 1987, Margaret Thatcher won her third general elections in a row. Remember, 1979, 1983 after the Falkland War, and 1987. And so this is what I will discuss on next Monday. She was encouraged into even more reforms because, of course, she felt she had the support of the population to do this, but willing to go too far in her reforms created some social discontent, and she had to resign in 1990. But that's going to be for next Monday. So next Monday, if you're okay with that, let's meet at 4 o'clock, and or 4 point. I mean, it could be 4:05, right? But I mean, around 4 o'clock. And I will conclude this lesson by seeing why Margaret Thatcher had to resign in 1990 and the legacy she's left in the UK. And then I will talk in the rest of the week about the social changes in the UK that happened throughout the period on women, on the youth, and I think we'll be done with the UK's lesson. Okay? Do you have any question? So you will find a fully written up version of all this on Moodle. Okay, so Margaret Thatcher, the main facts from 83 to 90, but that's it. Any question you have? No? So I wish you a happy day. I wish you a good weekend, and so see you on Monday, right? It was a pleasure being there, and take care of yourself. See you. Bye-bye.